They thought they had already uncovered every corner of Graceland. The rhinestone jumpsuits, the shimmering trophies, the fleet of Cadillacs polished to perfection under glass. Yet beyond the velvet ropes and manicured halls existed a space no ticket holder was ever invited to see. Beneath the main floors, sealed off from cameras and guides, sat a basement untouched since the king's final days. What rested in its shadows would silence even the most devoted admirers. Dust clung to boxes stacked against damp walls, a heavy safe rusting in the corner, journals and tapes that revealed a side of Elvis Presley no spotlight had ever captured. For years, the family had guarded it fiercely, building his legacy upstairs while keeping his private world locked underground. But once the door was finally opened, the discoveries rewrote the story of a man both worshipped and haunted. What lingered below wasn't a shrine to his glory. It was a time capsule of his struggles, fears, and the truths he never intended for the public to know. Graceland had long been more than a home. To millions, it became a sanctuary, a place where pilgrims came to touch a fragment of their idol's life. They walked through the jungle room, marveled at mirrored staircases, ran their hands across velvet-lined walls, and gazed at walls of gold records. But what most never understood was that the real pulse of Graceland wasn't in the brightly lit displays. It was hidden down a narrow stairway, a part of the house quietly kept off-limits. Tour guides would gloss over it, offering vague explanations that it was closed for private family use. Even among employees, the subject was taboo, sparking hushed rumors about what the king had hidden there. Some whispered he recorded late-night demos in secret, songs too raw to share. Others insisted he used it as a refuge, retreating from the suffocating demands of celebrity. Collectors speculated endlessly, convinced that if Elvis preserved anything truly personal, it wouldn't be upstairs under spotlights. It would be locked away below. The truth, however, was darker than even the wildest theories. Because when the basement was finally unsealed, what emerged wasn't just memorabilia. It was evidence of a man struggling to hold himself together while the world believed he was untouchable. The first discoveries were unassuming. Plain cardboard boxes, taped shut, their labels nearly erased by time. Inside were reels of magnetic tape, each scrawled with Elvis's handwriting. Midnight thoughts. Never play. For me only. These weren't rehearsals for studio tracks. They were confessions disguised as recordings. Elvis alone with his guitar, voice stripped of theatrics, fragile and aching. Some reels captured him singing songs no one had ever heard before, intimate ballads of regret and isolation. Others contained no music at all, only his voice speaking to the silence, as though the microphone were his only confidant. Alongside them were notebooks, their pages crowded with scribbled lyrics and desperate reflections. One haunting line read, "Fame is the loneliest prison, and I am its guard and captive all at once." On another page, 3 words repeated over and over, "I want peace." Mixed in with the writings were photos never intended for the public. Grainy images of Elvis alone at the piano, his face hidden in shadow, cigarette dangling, shoulders slumped. Others showed him wandering Graceland's hallways at night, gaunt, weary, consumed by solitude. These weren't the images of the myth, but of a man unraveling beneath the weight of being Elvis Presley. As more trunks were brought into the light, the picture deepened. Some contained costumes that never graced the stage. Half-finished jumpsuits, rhinestones missing, sketches abandoned midway. But among the ordinary sat unsettling relics. One chest overflowed with prescription bottles, some still half-filled, all bearing his name. A few bore cryptic notes scratched onto tape, "For nights when sleep won't come," or "Take when walls close in." Alongside them were stacks of worn spiritual texts from nearly every tradition, Christian scripture beside Buddhist teachings, astrology guides, and esoteric writings on life after death. It was as though he was reaching in every direction for something that might quiet his unrest. Other boxes revealed personal obsessions, firearms, police badges, and memorabilia linked to law enforcement, a fascination Elvis had cultivated throughout his life. Here, collected in secret, they felt less like novelties and more like symbols of control in a world that often spun beyond his grasp. In another trunk were peculiar costumes, robes, masks, uniforms, garments never worn on stage, each one resembling a disguise. In the dim basement light, they seemed eerie, as though Elvis had prepared alternate versions of himself to escape into when the crown became unbearable. Piece by piece, the collection built a portrait of a man desperate to hold on to power over his identity, even as he lost it to the myth of the king. Then came the most chilling discovery, a set of reel-to-reel tapes tucked away in a chest marked private. Unlike the earlier recordings, these were not musical. They were spoken monologues, unfiltered midnight reflections. One began with long silence, broken only by the sound of him shifting and sighing before whispering, "I don't know who I am anymore." For the next hour, he poured out thoughts that had never reached even his closest companions. He spoke of betrayal, of trusted friends who had turned on him, of handlers who controlled his every move. He spoke of his lost marriage, voice cracking as he mentioned Priscilla, of the mistakes he couldn't undo. In another, he spoke tenderly of Lisa Marie, his daughter, calling her his anchor, the only pure light in his fractured life. But most haunting were his reflections on fame itself. He described it as a curse, a cage gilded in gold, a mask he couldn't remove. "They cheer for the king," he murmured, "but nobody sees the man who has to go home alone." At moments, his voice slipped into paranoia, certain that unseen forces watched him, exploited him, and waited for his downfall. At others, he sounded like a man begging the dark for mercy. These tapes weren't designed for posterity. They were raw confessions, hidden in the one place he thought would never be breached. Eventually, attention turned to a heavy steel safe pressed against the far wall, its surface corroded, its lock sealed for decades. After careful effort, the door groaned open, releasing air that smelled of another time. Inside were neatly arranged envelopes in Elvis's own script. They weren't contracts or financial documents. They were letters. Many were addressed to Priscilla, unsent drafts of love and sorrow. One confessed, "I wish I could have been stronger for you. I wore the crown, but I couldn't be the man you needed." Others carried bitterness, blaming unnamed advisors and the machinery of fame for tearing their bond apart. Then there were the letters to Lisa Marie, some written as though to the little girl she was, others to the woman he imagined she would become. They overflowed with warnings about the dangers of celebrity, about how fame devoured everything it touched. In one, written months before his death, he admitted, "I don't want you to live in my shadow. I want you to walk free of the chains that bound me." The safe also contained a journal, its pages filled with notes about declining health, distrust of those around him, and dreams of vanishing altogether. One line stood out with chilling clarity. "If I vanish, they'll never let me rest. If I stay, they'll work me to death. Either way, I lose." The further the excavation went, the more disturbing the artifacts became. Elvis had collected newspaper clippings of fellow musicians who had died young: Buddy Holly, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison. He underlined passages, scribbling notes in the margins. "Too soon. Why not me? And this is how legends fall." Manila folders contained police reports and case files unrelated to his life, as though he had studied the collapse of others, piecing together a pattern of downfall. His notebooks grew increasingly frantic, scrawled passages about surveillance, betrayal, and the feeling that even those closest to him were complicit in his undoing. "They want the king," one page read, "but they don't care if the man dies." In a corner trunk, they found disguises: wigs, mustaches, uniforms, robes. Some were pristine, others worn. Maps tucked beside them showed routes out of Memphis, hotels marked, notes hinting at escape. Were these props for fantasies or genuine preparations for disappearing? The line blurred. It seemed he was both planning and dreaming of a way out, knowing the cage of Elvis Presley would never open on its own. When these discoveries reached the family, the impact was devastating. For years, they had curated his image, balancing myth and memory, protecting both his fans and themselves from the fractures beneath the surface. But the letters, recordings, and relics laid bare wounds that time hadn't healed. The drafts to Priscilla reopened the pain of a love destroyed by fame's relentless grip. The notes to Lisa Marie revealed a father already aware of the chains fame would place on her, chains she too would later struggle against. Even the financial documents tucked among the personal items painted a grim picture of a man who felt like a resource rather than a person. His fortune stretched thin, his trust betrayed. Most harrowing of all was the evidence that he had considered vanishing, leaving behind not just his career but his very identity. For his family, the realization must have been unbearable that Elvis had not only died young, but that he had been spiritually unraveling long before his body failed.